The War Resistors Support Campaign in Canada started in early 2004 when Jeremy Hinsman and his family came to Canada because they had decided that they opposed the Iraq War, and Jeremy had learned that his unit, the 82nd Airborne, was going to be sent to Iraq. He had applied previously for conscientious objector status and of course had not received it. So that option being cancelled, they decided Canada. And they came in January 2004, and they were introduced to a lawyer, Jeffrey House, who was taking a lot of the war resistor cases. And when he spoke with them, he realized, being a draft dodger himself from the Vietnam War, that there might be others coming after the Hinsmans. And so he got in touch with the Canadian Peace Alliance, and they set up a little subcommittee. Should we get involved in this? The subcommittee said yes, and it broke away from the Peace Alliance, became its own thing. And that's the War Resistors Support Campaign. It started with just a few people. Sure enough, within a month or two, Brandon Huey, another war resistor, came up from the States. And since then there's been a steady trickle, I would say. It hasn't been a flood, it's been a trickle, but it's been quite steady. Sometimes more, sometimes less, but now we're in touch with probably 40 or 50 war resistors in Canada, and we know there are many others living underground and so on. Many of these war resistors come with their families. This is a family decision. So I got involved shortly after that in April 2004. I got an email from a friend of mine who I'd worked on many issues with. And so I went to the meeting, and I was impressed with the people who were there, because I knew them. And I knew they were serious people. So we got started. They had already drawn up a declaration of principles and had gotten a number of prominent Canadians to sign on. And they were planning a press conference, and the press conference was held in late April, I think, 2004, and the big announcement was that we were starting a petition campaign to get the government to make a provision that would allow the war resistors and their families to stay in Canada in a way similar to people like myself who went up to Canada during the Vietnam War. And that's been our goal ever since. The campaign has grown. We have chapters now in most parts of Canada, especially from Ontario west. We have war resistors living in many parts of the country, mostly in southern Ontario, but also in Saskatchewan, in British Columbia, and northern Ontario, and so on. And the campaign has become quite, I would say, a newsmaker in Canada, and I would add around the world, in the sense that a lot of media around the world are very interested to hear what American military people have to say for themselves without being filtered through the mouth of George Bush or some general or something. And this is one group that can do that without penalty in Canada anyway. So the impact of this small number of people has been, I would say, incredibly out of proportion to their numbers, and I think this is something that annoys the powers that be. In any case, what we have had to do is come up with a strategy. Our strategy is political and legal. So on the political side, we're pressing the government to make a provision that would allow all the war resistors to stay in Canada. And this provision has not, our government has not brought in such a provision, but we've got far enough that the Parliament of Canada voted on June 3rd by a vote of 137 to 110 to call for a provision saying that any conscientious objector who comes to Canada who refuses to take part in a war not sanctioned by the United Nations should be allowed to remain in Canada and after 2 years apply for permanent resident status. And secondly, any deportation proceedings against such people should be stopped. The other side of the campaign has been the legal side, and this has basically been people the war resistors making refugee claims and going through the lengthy and rather painful refugee process. It's a lot of paperwork. It leads to a hearing before a member of the Immigration and Refugee Board, and eventually a decision will come down from that individual, and all the decisions so far have been negative. However, it helps the war resistors because it gains them time. in Canada. While you're a refugee claimant, you can get a work permit and get a job and so on. You can get health care, and you can basically become part of the Canadian scene. The refugee claims, as I say, have been getting denied, and so we have been appealing. Originally, we appealed Jeremy Hinsman's and Brandon Huey's cases. They were the first guys, all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada. And the Supreme Court declined to hear the case, upholding the lower court's judgment that the refugee hearings had been okay and that they were not refugees and they should, eventually probably leave Canada. More recently, in the case of Joshua Key, who is one of the better-known war resistors because he wrote a book called The Deserter's Tale, which everyone who watches this video should immediately go out and buy, because it helps Josh and his wife and 4 children. Anyway, Josh's decision came down on July 4th, so it was a very nice 4th of July gift. And the federal court justice in that case said that his refugee hearing had been flawed and ordered that he be given a new refugee hearing with a different member of the Immigration and Refugee Board chairing it, and that the flaws should be corrected. And among the flaws was a seeming requirement that the only thing you could refuse to do and seek refugee protection were war crimes. But brutal and degrading treatment of other people, if it didn't rise to the level of a war crime, didn't get you refugee protection. Mr. Justice Barnes said that was just wrong. Secondly, he said, our courts have been saying to the war resistors, well, why didn't you apply for CO status? Why didn't you ask, literally, why didn't they ask to be released from the army? And no sort of response from the lawyer, Jeffrey House or some of the other lawyers, has been enough to convince them that this really is not much of an option. So Mr. Justice Barnes, however, said that when Joshua Key was on leave from Iraq, he'd been there 7 or 8 months, came back to his family in Fort Carson, and they discussed what to do. He couldn't stand what he was doing. He was blowing the doors off houses and screaming children, screaming, crying women, all the men loaded onto a truck, the soldiers, in some cases, stealing the goods of these people, all that kind of thing. He did that about 100 times, and it disgusted him. And he saw other things as well that just disgusted him. And he said, I can't go back. I can't go back. So what do we do? So he had a 2-week leave. Mr. Justice Barnes pointed out, that's not enough time to make a CO application and get a decision on it. He would have had to go back to Iraq and wait for a decision on his CO application, which would, in 98% of the cases, be negative anyway. So it was actually a pointless thing for our judges to say he should have done that. So his options really were either just, suck it up and drive on, as the Army says, or maybe seek refuge in Canada. And maybe that's what Canada will have to look at.